It always starts with a rumour, and this one was too bizarre to ignore. Word spread quietly at first that back in the early 2000s, Ozzy Osbourne had paid exactly $50,000 cash for a rundown roadside motel outside Flagstaff, Arizona. No contract, no legal representation, just a handshake with a man who refused to give his last name, and people couldn't agree on why a global rock icon would buy a forgotten building with 12 broken windows, a roof that sagged like it was tired of existing, and a neon sign that flickered the word vacancy even when nobody stayed there. But the strangest part was that Ozzy told almost nobody, not even Sharon, and those closest to him swore he went alone to a place locals warned travellers to avoid after dark because something had happened. The motel looked ordinary from the road, a rectangle of sagging stucco and rusting chairs. But the closer he got, the more everything felt wrong. Ozzy described it later as a dead place that didn't realise it was dead. The lobby carpet stained like someone had dragged something heavy across it years earlier, cigarette smoke soaked into wallpaper, and a silence so thick he felt he'd walked into a conversation that had been cut mid-sentence, and the first time he unlocked room 14, the door swung open as if someone had been waiting on the other side, and the room was too clean, too intact. A bed with crisp white sheets, a small TV older than most of his vans, a Bible on the nightstand that looked hardly touched. But the oddest thing was an old cheap 970s acoustic guitar sitting upright in the corner. He left and thought he could forget it, but the thing followed him. He started dreaming in colours that didn't have names, and waking to the same 4 chords, repeating like a heartbeat. Sharon noticed the progressions he hummed when he woke, and asked where he'd heard them, but answering would mean admitting the absurd truth that the guitar in room 14 wasn't just an object, but a door, and the motel wasn't merely abandoned, but storing something alive, and Ozzy kept returning alone at night because some obsessions require privacy, and each time he found the bed made, the guitar in its corner, the light working as if the room existed inside a pocket of time that refused to decay, and one night he sat on the bed and picked the guitar up until the first strum cracked. The first sound wasn't sound exactly, it was a memory that wasn't his. Flashes of a man he'd never met, long hair, a cheap denim jacket, fingertips bleeding on steel strings, writing a song he swore would change the world and yet never got finished. Ozzy knew the chords before his hands found them like déjà vu, on repeat, and the vision ended with a knock, 3 slow knocks that sank into his skull and haunted him for weeks, waking him with his hand on the guitar as if somebody were knocking from inside his own mind, and he realised there was a reason the melody felt unfinished. Someone needed it finished. Someone trapped in that room. He began to investigate quietly, using favours and phone numbers gathered over decades, and learned that the motel had once been owned by a man named Elmer Rudd, a Vietnam veteran who bought the place in 1972 and vanished in 1981, and locals whispered that room 14 took him like some hungry corner of the world that chose people, and though Ozzy didn't believe in ghost stories, he believed in energy, an unfinished business, and the way music can hang in the air like a debt. And then he received a call from an unknown number, and a voice said 2 words, "Continue playing," only to hang up, and that night he flew back to the motel with the resolve to finish the song because it had stopped being a choice. And though Ozzy didn't believe in ghost stories, he believed in energy and the second time he played, the room reacted as if it were alive. The ancient TV switched to static, the lights jittered, the bed trembled like something underneath it was breathing, and halfway through a chord progression he began to hear breathing behind him that turned into whispering, a voice naming the very chords he played. E minor, C, G, D, C, G, D. A week later, Ozzy told Sharon everything because secrets like this are heavy and obsession hollows. A person out if no one answers, and Sharon hired a private investigator named Clark Bennett who specialised in missing persons and old records, and when Clark dug he found 11 people who had stayed in room 14 between 1973 and 1980 and were never seen again. Not murdered and not checked out, but simply gone with cars still in the lot and belongings left behind, their names frozen in the ledger like small fingerprints that refused to blur. And every last entry came with a neighbour's report that guitar music had been heard around 3 in the morning. The same repeating 4 chords Ozzy now couldn't escape, and Sharon told him to stop going, but Ozzy haunted night. Clark brought back boxes and a cassette tape labelled Room 14, last recording, and when they pressed play, the tape began with static, and then that old melody, until a voice whispered, "I can't finish it." Someone else must, followed by 3 knocks and a scream that tore the tape and the room apart in their studio, and Ozzy sat hands shaking and then booked a private flight alone because he believed finishing that song where it began was the only way to close whatever door the room had become. He arrived at night, heart thudding, keys in a pocket, and when he stepped into room 14 a smell rose up that was part lemon pledge, part cigarette smoke, and he sat on the bed with the guitar and strummed once, and the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, the walls humming as if they had lungs, and as he played the pounding at the door returned, 3 patient slow knocks, and then sliding footsteps, and as he did not stop the music shaped itself into a progression he had never learned but knew, and he felt a presence pressing close, an ancient pressure that was not malevolent so much as unfinished, and then the guitar moved his hands into new chords, and the melody that had haunted him for nights resolved into something like release. When the final chord sounded, every light in the motel burst like small suns and the guitar snapped in his hands as if it had been played into pieces, and then something stepped out of the music. Denim jacket, scratched fingers, eyes raw with a life he did not begrudge, and the man said one word, finally, and dissolved like smoke into the air while the room's air shot up hot, then dropped cold as if someone had closed a lung, and when Ozzy looked down a scratch on the fretboard read, "Leave. Now." So urgent it felt like a hand pushing him, and he left without turning back. But for the first time in weeks, the song that had lived in his head fell silent. Months later, Clark kept digging and found that after Ozzy bought the motel, ownership changed 19 times, and every buyer lasted less than a year with complaints of electrical problems and mold and structural failure and an odd pattern. Room 14 was never rented out. Its door stayed locked and the bedding remained pristine while the guitar waited as if it inhabited a separate calendar. And the ledger entries showed check-ins left untouched like dolls on a shelf, and people who purchased the property often complained of odd noises and left hastily as if some magnet in the place made success impossible. To push against the thing that would not let him forget, Ozzy gave $100,000 to renovate a guitar shop in Santa Monica that was about to close, telling the owner in private only, "Never leave a song unfinished." And the owner, a woman named Rosa, swore that months after reopening a man in an old denim jacket walked into the shop after midnight and stood in front of the instruments without touching them before vanishing without a shadow. And the rumour spread that on certain nights at 3 a.m. you could hear 4 chords drifting across the highway like a memory, looking for get. Friends warned him to stop speaking because monsters feed on attention and superstition grows like mould when you blink at it. But Ozzy couldn't. And sometimes in interviews he would tilt his head and say offhand that some songs are doors and some rooms are pantries for memory, and then chuckle and change the subject. And the fact he kept mentioning it made people listen and made the motel's legend grow until Flagstaff late-night radio shows had callers swearing they'd heard a faint tune across the empty highway, and truck drivers refused to park by the neon sign because monsters feed on attention because of a weight you could feel in the chest. Sharon argued the rational point that men with endless access to strange things can be consumed by them, and that charity and obsession are cousins. And Clark argued the records merely suggested a pattern, but Ozzy kept returning to room 14 in the way some people return to a wound, because clicking the final chord felt like paying a debt he had unknowingly inherited. And people close to him noticed he woke sometimes with his palm puckered in the shape of a string, as if he'd been playing in his sleep, and they wondered if the world had given him the problem as penance for some old debt. Rosa's shop became a small pilgrimage, and the city paper wrote a human interest piece titled "How a Rock Star Saved a Shop After Ozzy's Donation," focusing on customers and the new life behind the storefront. But there were as many accounts in comment sections about the denim jacket man at midnight as there were about the shop being saved, and some teenagers dared each other to drive out to the back road and park under the sign on April 4th at 3 a.m, where they said a loop of 4 chords sometimes played soft as a stool unspooled, where they said a thock. Clark found an old photograph in the county records, a grainy black and white of a younger Elmer holding a battered guitar and grinning at the camera, and on the back in a hurried hand someone had scrawled "Continue" and dated it the 4th of April 1978, as if an instruction had been left for any successor to read, and for those who had the ledger and the photograph the pieces fit together like an instruction manual for puzzles that were not meant to be solved. Ozzy sometimes woke in the middle of the night and thought he heard a rhythm under the house, a heartbeat of wood and rope and wind, and he would go downstairs and sit at the piano and play chords in the dark until the house answered with silence, and he would think about the man who had been freed and wonder if freeing one thing makes room for another, like pulling a skein of thread at one end and watching things unravel at the other. Occasionally a reporter would call and ask if the story was true, and Ozzy would deflect and say nothing public because some stories are private and some closures are owed to ghosts who sleep until someone else notices. But Sergeant Ramirez in Flagstaff once told a young investigative journalist that the police file on Elmer was cold and thin, and that nothing in the world of paperwork could explain the ledger entries. 11 names, signatures, and check-in times. And Ramirez looked down the page when he said it. As if the ledger had a face that watched back. People who witnessed the motel's many owners swear the property resisted. That electric panels burned out months after purchase, and that a scent of lemon and cigarette clung to door frames no matter how many cleaning crews they hired. And one buyer said the front office calendar would flip days ahead by itself, while another awoke to the sound of a song he could not place, humming inside the walls, and they all ended the same: a quick sale, an asking price far below market, a buyer who left with a thin, anxious smile and a suitcase because Ozzy had made the motel his weird secret. The town spun stories, and the stories spun back until the motel became a character in its own right, and young musicians would stand in the parking lot and try to hum that 4-chord loop until it felt like breathing, while old-timers cursed at the neon light and told visitors to stay clear after dusk because some doors are best left shut, and the seasonal rumour grew like Ivy Clark found more tapes in a shoebox at the county archive, tapes recorded by people who stayed in adjacent rooms who had woken at 3 a.m, to that same melody, leaking through thin drywall, and had written in the margins of motel stationery things like "can't sleep, music next door," and I thought it was an animal until it formed words, and their handwriting trembled like they had been near something. Rosa swore that after the renovation the shop seemed to attract odd customers at odd hours, men with denim jackets and a sadness that felt worn into seam, and she kept one guitar behind glass with a small plaque that read, "In memory of Song," a quiet object with a price she never intended to sell because she felt it might be too dangerous to let it move. And sometimes at closing the staff swore they heard a faint figure walking the aisles in the dark, who left no footprint and who smelled of cold smoke. The motel's name was painted over once, and new signs went up and came down, and people tried to erase the rumour, but the rumour writes itself. Room 14, they said, waits like an unstruck match, and teenagers dared one another until seriousness took the place of bravado and a hush grew over the lot, and they left the motel alone at night where the neon still remembered to flicker whether anyone was watching or not. A radio host in Phoenix did a 2-hour segment, calling it "The Chord That Wouldn't Die," and listeners called in with stories about losing things and finding them again, and about the feeling that some obligations require a person who can play through them. And the station received an anonymous donation after the show, $100,000, made to a community music program with instructions to teach kids to finish the songs they start, which was the sort of thing people believed came from a good charity, but the account records showed a wire from an account Ozzy used for quiet things, and no one publicly connected the dots until someone did the chord that, with $100,000 made to a community music program with instructions to teach kids to finish them. Years passed, and Flagstaff's back road gained an ache like a scar, and the motel acquired the pedigree of a haunted thing people told on summer nights when drinks are warm and the moon is high, and some nights the motel hummed and some nights it slept. But every April 4th a strange handful of the brave and the foolish would park under the word vacancy, and listen until they heard 4 chords, and the world seemed to lean toward them as if waiting for a response. Ozzy grew older, and the melody receded into his life like a tide he thought he'd outlasted, but the memory of Elmer's face in that photograph haunted him in quiet moments, and he kept thinking that freeing one person out of a long list of missing ones meant he had only answered one call, and that somewhere another call might be waiting on a different frequency, and sometimes late at night he would call Clark, and they would talk about the ledger and the small things that point to truths if you know how to read them. The city paper wrote an anniversary piece about Rosa's shop and the renovated storefront, and how a single gift saved a business and taught kids to play, and children learned to finish songs and to listen to the spaces between notes, but some of those children heard a different kind of lesson, that music can be a key, and keys sometimes open doors that were meant to stay locked. Old-timers still avoid the back road and tell the story in a slow voice, but tourists keep coming with flashlights and bravado. And one summer a documentary crew arrived and left discs of footage. No one could explain where the sound cut in and hummed an old chord that matched the one from room 14, and the editor quit the project halfway through, leaving tapes uncut in a drawer and a note that said, "Some things finish themselves when you stop looking," which made people speculate and some of the brave even more curious. Sometimes, when the night is still and the highway far enough to blur into a glassy ribbon, you can drive past that old building and swear you hear a small repeating phrase, 4 chords that rise and fall like breath, and whether you believe in hauntings or in the stubborn life of music, the song has become part of the landscape and a warning, and the question that lingers at dawn is, who will be the next to go into that waiting room and pick up the guitar and play through the part that has been left unfinished for decades? People ask whether the melody healed or cursed, whether Ozzy freed a man or opened something else, whether donations and shopfronts and charity can absolve the strange debts the world accumulates, and the ledger sits in county archives with scribbles and dates and signatures while roses bloom near the road and the neon keeps flickering because some things refuse to die quietly, and while answers multiply like rumours, a single simple truth stays, that when a song is left undone, it can crawl into people's heads and become a weight they carry until they hand it to someone who knows the chords. And for those who still listen, the old story tightens around its final question. If you ever hear an unfinished melody calling in the night, will you be the one to walk toward the door, or will you be the one who walks away and leaves that chord hanging forever? And then the knock came, slow and deliberate, and everything waited.